This is the colonial era building in Hobart that we're going to draw. And this reference photo will be on my channel community page. So if at the end you want to accept the challenge, you can have a go drawing it yourself. When we think of foreshortening, we're thinking of the fact that as a building or any object moves away from us, it gets smaller. Now, this getting smaller is what produces these perspective angles. But it also makes objects that are equally spaced in life appear closer and closer together as they move further away from where we're standing and viewing. I have a simple strategy which I think has given me a head start on accuracy when I draw foreshortening, or when I draw the effect of foreshortening freehand in ink. So there's no erasing. I have to get it as correct as possible first time. And that's the way I observe, and the reference points that I look for, and the alignment that I do. And I have actually drawn this already now, so you can see some of the scribbles I've put on the photo that gives some indication of what I'm doing. But let me just explain a few of the principles. The first thing to do is to draw the things I can draw most accurately, most confidently, that will set me up for the rest of the positioning. And in this case, it really was this gate area, particularly this section. I can position this fairly well, and I can look at the relative width across the entire scene. And at this point, it's pretty much flat, so I haven't got to worry about perspective angles. This is very close enough to eye level. That lets me then drop down, and it lets me get these angles started. And when I've drawn this section, I can start to look now that this post is just this distance. And I look at this distance. This is what I'm looking at, this width here. More common, but more problematic, is to look at this line, which of course, because it's a diagonal, the actual line is longer. And because of that, it's easy to overextend these lines and basically run out of width before we've gone completely across our reference onto our paper. And it's particularly true with lines such as these ones, which are quite long diagonals. I like to get a sense of where this line, say, will be, the line on top. You'll see me actually do a light line or a dotted line to give me a sense of where this entablature starts. And I pay particular attention. I really fuss over getting the angles correct, particularly this first angle I draw, because all the others build on the first one. But once I've got that, I really start by drawing the columns, because they're now the easiest way I have of going width-wise, of, if you like, establishing the foreshortening. So I draw this column, and then this column is basically just this distance again, maybe a fraction smaller. And then I look at this width. Now that width, it's about the same as that width of those two. Again, I'm not going with the perspective, I'm just going straight across. And then I have another column, and then I have another column which is not as wide as this column and has a corner visible as well. And then I look at this gap, and then I have another column. And all the while, and you'll see me as I do this, I'm mostly just establishing this collar at the top of the shaft. And the further down we go, the less detail we have to show, the less precision we have to show in these capitals anyway. We start to just suggest the effect of the capitals. And then down here, I'm looking at this width, and then another column, aware that this column is thinner than this column is thinner than this column. This column is a bit different, this round one, because it's half hidden by this square column on the end. And then there's a very small gap, and then we have a double column that's so close together that we really can hardly make them out. And then we just have a gap which is better drawn by just a thick line. And then we have another column and another square column on the end, as we have here. It's all to do with going across, not going down on the angle, but going straight across horizontally. If we're drawing same size, another way we can tell how we're going as we get to the right-hand side or the left-hand side, whichever way you start, is to see what this gap is between the end of the subject and the end of the paper. So I'm always watching how close I am to the end of the paper as I start to approach those sections of my drawing. Once I get these widths established using the columns as my main method, then when I come up to the top here, I can see that this one aligns directly with that one. This one lines directly with that one. This one lines directly with that one, and so forth. The other thing I did was to look to see where these columns aligned with the section of fencing and fence posts that I'd drawn. So for instance, this column came down straddling the edge. This column came down just inside this section. And if there's an inconsistency between how it aligns here and my perception of how it should be aligning here, then I know I might have to make some adjustments if possible to try and bring everything back into a tighter precision. So let's start drawing this now. And if you're finding this helpful, please hit the like button. It really is a way you can help me as well on my, if you like, YouTube drawing journey.
So I start to put into practice the strategy you've just heard me outline. Start with this largest, closest gate post, fence post, because it really is the most straightforward thing to draw, particularly because it's pretty much on eye level, and therefore the horizontal line at the top is actually horizontal. So that's an advantage at this point. And I'm also, because it is close to the edge, paying attention to the actual border that I've established with the tape. And these angles of the railings are really important because they're establishing the perspective angles for the rest of the scene as well. So I'm being fairly careful and cautious, checking the angles. I want to get a sense of the decoration on this closest one. It's worth spending a little more time with the detail with architecture that's closer to us, because then the brain will put that into the further parts of the architecture without us actually having to draw it. Now with these rails, foreshortening, very important. The rails rapidly become closer together and thinner as they move along, to the point where if we look at the right side of the railing, it's pretty much a solid block of metal in terms of what we see. This is where we have to draw what we see, not what we know, which is that there are gaps right the way to the end. But the angle, the perspective, doesn't show those gaps as they move further away and visually compress with what we call foreshortening. So now I'm doing the second gate post, one of the smaller ones, and again paying attention to the horizontal distance between the first one that we've drawn and this one, and trying to just plot that width in my head and not think about angles until I go to actually draw the railings on. And because I know I'm going to use these posts to align the architecture above or further back, it is worth spending just a little bit more time. I'm using a 0.3 millimeter pen here. When I've done these posts and the railing and I go to the building behind, I switch to a 0.2 millimeter pen, and I use a 0.1 just for that next building along the street, just to really have it sit right the way back. Now, I'm keeping this fairly gestural. I'm going to just do a few little bits of hatching for shading to just make things a little bit clearer, but I don't want to have many lines on it besides the actual lines to establish the forms. And here I am now with this fence down here. And it's also important to notice that the decorations on the rails also have to follow the perspective angles. We need to get that fan shape of lines that slowly increase in angle as they go above or as they go below the eye level. So I position this corner, as I said, both from the edge of the paper and using the fence posts that I've drawn. And now I work on this angle. I actually spend a little more time doing this than I've allowed here. I cut a bit of it out just because it got a bit boring to watch. But it really is important, this first major angle, to get it right, because the angles will be increasing even more as they go above that. And so if I want to capture that extreme sloping angle at the top, I need to be sloping this angle enough. And also, if the angle doesn't slope correctly, then the foreshortening is going to look not quite right, even if I do it properly. Because how quickly things foreshorten as they move along away from us depends on the angle. The steeper the angle, the faster they foreshorten. And therefore, if we were to draw some rapidly foreshortened columns in terms of their spacing, but the angle was too shallow, there would be something about it that just doesn't look right. So getting the angle in proportion to the foreshortening compression is really important. Need to draw that before I can establish the columns behind. So I've been going across simply looking at the widths between columns, gaps between columns, columns next to each other, and then now cross-checking how this goes with the width to the edge of the paper, and putting the figure in here to get a sense of scale as well. If we can't draw a figure that really looks like it's in the scene, that could walk towards us or walk into a nearby building without looking too large or too small, then we know we have a problem with our scale. Being able to put figures into our streets that really match up with the buildings and other street furniture that we've drawn is a great way of seeing if all our proportions are correct. Now I'm doing some of the detail between the columns, where we can see these arches. These two, we have a windows, and then I think we have a doorway, and then there's two more arches that we can't really see at all on the far side. I don't want to get bogged down in too much detail, and I don't want to get caught up with too much hatching, or else there'll be so many lines it'll be hard to see what's what. But the actual position changes, so we don't see as it moves further down into the actual window section of this second window. We just see some of the wall thickness and some of the arch, and even less down here. And we have perspective angles that we need to take some measure of accuracy with as decorative lines alluding to stonework across the face of the building. I actually have to move a light and change position to get these lines in place. Now they're pretty light, and this is where I kind of do a bit of a mess up. What I do is besides really bodging that line up and those lines as well, again, I thought, oh, this is really wrecked it, but they weren't so noticeable at the end, I don't think. And I'm positioning these brackets, these decorative brackets. I'm simplifying them, but I'm making sure that the spacing is correct, which will be far more obvious if I get it wrong, because the spacing of these brackets foreshortens. They appear closer together, much closer together on the far side of the building. But even on this left-hand side, they become closer together slightly as they move from left to right. And I do just a little bit of hatching to make it clear where the overhang is. Now, my mess up is here with this column. I've taken it right down to the top of the entablature, when in fact there is another section that rises from the entablature that hides most of the base of the columns. I don't know if you can see it. You see, I've just drawn it there through the base, and that's why my column was just looking a bit long. So what I've done, I've put some balusters in to kind of hide the overdrawing, or I could have just left it, but I did think it would look a bit top heavy if the columns were that high. There's not a great deal of detail to do here, so I'm doing that. And look, I'm sorry I turned the camera off and forgot to turn it back on, but here's our finished artwork with the last details done exactly the same way as the first ones were done. Not so difficult to do. once we've got to this point.
G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Well, what do you think? Did I get the foreshortening tightly enough? Did I keep the proportions correct enough? Does it look right? Although I had a few issues with it, they weren't really with the foreshortening, they were with some other aspects of it. But I hope this has been a helpful explanation of the way I think. How we draw always flows from how we think. If we think in the most helpful way, then we're setting ourselves up for drawing success. But look, whatever you draw, however you draw it, however it turns out, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.